Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Um, my name is Dan Russell. I'm a senior research associate here at the Eudaimonia Institute for the semester. And I'm pleased to be introducing, first of all, Wake Forest's own Robert Waples. Robert is the Howe Family Faculty Fellow. Is it Howe? Huff? Okay, well, it's English, so the letters could be pronounced anyway. The Huff Family Faculty Fellow and Professor of Economics here at Wake. His research deals primarily with the history of American labor markets and consensus among economists. He is the editor of the Independent Review, Pope Francis, and the Caring Society, the Handbook of Modern Economic History, and the Handbook of Major Events in Economic History, and the Economic Crisis in Retrospect. This morning he's speaking to us about God, man, and human happiness, two approaches. Please welcome Robert Waples.
If I close this lid, will anything bad happen? Good. So my paper is titled God, Man, and Human Happiness, Two Approaches, and the paper examines these two approaches. First, the anthropological approach of revealed religion as embodied in Christianity, and then the empirical approach of modern social sciences as embodied in recent research on subjective well-being in fields like economics, psychology, and sociology. That first approach begins with a theory of humanity, as exemplified by Augustine of Hippo, who drew on his own struggles and teachings from the scripture to open his confessions, I believe, with pithiness and poetry, proclaiming to God, "Great are you, O God, and greatly to be praised. You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." That first approach proceeds by drawing together more than 4 millennia of divine revelation, philosophical wisdom, and debates among scholars and saints bent on grasping truth and the eternal. The second approach is primarily empirical and almost theory-free. It proceeds by drawing together more than 4 decades of research that used statistical methods to examine marginal effects, as well as debates among scholars and saints bent on grasping truth and tenure. So this religious approach begins with statements like this: God, infinitely perfect and blessed in himself in a plan of sheer goodness, freely created man to make him share in his own blessed life. For this reason, at every time and in every place, God draws close to man. He calls man to seek him, to know him, to love him with all his strength. He calls together all men, scattered and divided by sin, into the unity of his family, the church. To accomplish this, when the fullness of time had come, God sent his own Son as Redeemer and Savior. In his Son and through him he invites men to become, in the Holy Spirit, his adopted children, and thus heirs to his blessing. So in other words, God has created mankind for one purpose: that we might be happy, that we might share in the joys and blessings of him forever. These blessings are so great that St. Paul put it this way in his first letter to the Corinthians: "Eye has not seen, ear has not heard, what God has ready for those who love him." So, in approaching this, let's take Thomas Aquinas as our guide. And I have a wonderful daughter. She reads Aquinas to me every night. Well, almost every night. One question at a time. We're going through the Summa. And, you know, it's deep stuff. And so I will rely, instead of on Aquinas per se, I will rely more on a popularization of Aquinas, a book called My Way of Life by Walter Farrell, member of the Dominican Order. And so my summary of Aquinas is on our second page. So the Thomistic explanation and examination of happiness begins this way. Beneath the multitudinous and even conflicting desires of men, we can see one desire that gives unity and meaning, force and decision to all human desires. All men seek what they seek for one reason. They think that it will satisfy them. They believe that the accomplishment of their desires will make them happy. Happiness is the goal of all human activity. The child with his nose pressed longingly against the pet shop window is seeking not a dog, but happiness. The miner in the bowels of the earth is seeking not just coal, but happiness. The tragedy of man is not that he cannot find happiness, but that he looks for it in the wrong place. Because the desires of men are boundless, no particular good can perfectly satisfy him. An abundance of money? No. That brings no rest, but just restless striving for even more. Nor can honor, or fame, or human glory bring man to complete happiness of his desires. Nothing can satisfy man's will completely except the universal good. This is found not in any creature, but in God alone. Aquinas and the Church teach. So, attaining happiness, therefore, depends on morality. Man's task is to control his action in the desire of the good so that he may grow from time to eternity, from the smallness of himself to the greatness of God. This means control, right reason, and goodwill are within the power of every man. God has put them there. People, unfortunately, are too interested in pleasure, but great goals are achieved only through great effort. The vision of God is not brought to us on a serving platter. Rather, the kingdom of heaven is won by violence, that is, by effort. The Aquinas view, the Christian view, continues that virtue makes man's world interesting instead of boring. Vice always leads to boredom and despair, because only the good is satisfying. Vice sets man at war with himself, with God, and with his fellow men. Sin causes unhappiness. It corrupts human nature. It stains the human soul. No disease of the body, no matter how painful or loathsome, can be compared to sin, the disease of the soul. To avoid sin, one must follow God's law. Law is not a ball and chain dragging at eager footsteps of human liberty. It's a light, enabling man to step forward surely and easily on the right road to happiness. Man chooses happiness freely by his human acts, and yet we must also say that the happiness is a gift from God. Man needs the grace of God if he is to find true happiness. So to avoid sin, we must follow God's law. Imprudence is what brings unhappiness. We might almost say that imprudence is unhappiness. It condemns man to the futility of achieving goals that just do not satisfy him. The imprudent man is imprisoned in the dense jungle of base desire and ignoble satisfaction. Likewise, injustice destroys both the common good and the good of individual men. Injustice destroys the happiness of society. Justice, on the other hand, means happiness in society. When men are just, human energies can be directed without anxiety to the search for real happiness. So, to summarize this religious viewpoint, there are virtues that are required to attain happiness, both here on earth, but especially eternal happiness. Those virtues are, well, the cardinal virtues. Those of prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice, but also they must be joined to the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, to achieve happiness. However, this point of view cannot help but must not ignore that life can be full of suffering. As Jesus himself put it, whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. So lasting happiness can be nourished by suffering and by temporal unhappiness. After all, Christ, the Son of God, who became man, suffered himself, and we must share in this suffering. And Christians constantly remind themselves of this suffering. The final prayer of the Rosary, the Hail, Holy Queen, implores the Blessed Virgin Mary this way. It says, "To thee do we cry, poor banished children of Eve. To thee do we send up our sigh, mourning and weeping in this valley of tears. Ad te suspiramus, gementes et plentes, in hoc lacrimarum vale." Beautiful. Now, let's take this point of view and convert it into 4 levels of happiness. Back on our first sheet. As brought together by Robert Spitzer. He takes Aquinas and other philosophers, especially a good dose of Aristotle, and talks about what this implication is for 4 levels of happiness. That first level of happiness, down at the bottom of our sheet, is the one of immediate gratification. It's the one that comes from pleasures. A kiss, a good meal, getting plenty of sleep. Or as that good man Charlie Brown would have put it, happiness is 2 kinds of ice cream, right? But that happiness isn't very deep. It's very superficial. If that's all you pursue in life, you're going to find out the law of diminishing returns kicks in pretty quick, and you're just not going to live a very happy life. So most of us rise above to a second level of happiness. It's the personal achievement. It's the ego. It's the happiness that comes from success, especially earned success, from being smarter, from being prettier, from being more athletic, from being more successful in the things that people care about, and them knowing that you are, and you knowing that they know. It's very comparative, and that's what drives it, and it's a good happiness to a degree, just like the immediate gratification is. But it also has an Achilles heel, and that is, it's not going to satisfy you for very long, because it's about constant comparisons. And if other people realize that's what you are, and that you're constantly comparing them to you, and thinking that you're better than them, it's not going to go very far. But also, success is so difficult, because as you achieve success, you want more, and you keep comparing yourself with people who are more and more successful, and it's going to be impossible to keep climbing the success ladder once you're at a certain level, right? So there's going to be a lot of bruises to your ego. It has a crisis of happiness when you go, this is just not satisfying. I got to turn to something else. That's the third level of happiness. That's good beyond oneself. It's actually caring about other people and their needs, putting them ahead of yours once yours have been met. And so this is much more fulfilling. It's trying to be that good son, that good parent, that good husband, that good colleague, that good neighbor to everyone, even to strangers. But it has a crisis of happiness as well, says Robert Spitzer, because it can't fulfill our longing, our deepest desires, not just those that can be reached here, but deeper desires. Spitzer puts it this way: overcoming the limitations of third level happiness is manifest in 6 areas. It's the human desire for the unrestricted human desire to know, the unrestricted human desire for unconditional love and to be loved unconditionally, the human desire for perfect justice and goodness and to be perfectly just and good, something we can't achieve by ourselves. The desire for perfect beauty, the desire to be at home in all that is. These 5 desires culminate in a final desire, the desire for faith, the desire for a relationship with God. So, to achieve the highest level of happiness, after the third level of happiness proves to be incomplete, the ultimate good can only be reached in reaching for God and for the eternal in this religious point of view. Now let us turn our attention to the second approach, the social science approach. We've heard about this in a number of presentations the last day or so. This is one that primarily says, well, you want to find out how happy people are? Ask them what is their subjective level of well-being. And we've seen numbers on this, but here's a nice table, page 3, that looks at this. This I'm pulling together. It's a table from a paper by Rodney Stark and Meyer. And what you see up at the top is how frequently people attend religious services and the percentage of them that say they're very happy, pretty happy, not too happy. Wow, there they are. There are the numbers. People who are more frequent religious attenders report higher levels of happiness. It's not just that, it's across the board. Look down below. This holds for males, for females, for whites, for African Americans, for those under 30 in their 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and over 70, the married, single, divorced, widow, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish. Some of the gaps are smaller, some of them are bigger, but it's always there. Well, the next step, of course, is to control for confounding factors, to see what the marginal impact of this is. So flip to our last sheet, and let's see what we get on those social science findings. The Pew Research Center has collected data on this from many countries. They find that positive happiness religion link in 19 of the 26 countries that they examined. Blanchflower and Oswald have a giant data set and look at this. They control for all those other things you want to control, right? Your health and your income and your gender and religion and all those other kinds of things, and controlling for everything else. Frequent attendance at religious services is going to move you up the 10-point scale of happiness, that ladder of happiness, by about 0.35 to 0.5 rungs. So let's call that half a rung. That doesn't sound very big, but of course most people are around rung 6, 7, 8. And so that is a lot larger in that context. It's almost as large as the coefficient on marriage. Coefficient on marriage is more like a 0.65 in this study. So the coefficient in this study from frequent religious attendance is the second largest of those. Now, you might think correlation is not causation, but there's some longitudinal studies here, like Child's study, that shows that religiosity now leads to greater happiness later, like the Heedy et al. Longitudinal study. Rising religiosity leads to rising levels of happiness. Falling religiosity for individuals leads to falling levels of happiness. Tay et al. Survey some studies that say religiosity is also correlated with other indicators you think are tied to happiness. Lower suicide, less alcohol abuse, less depression, associated with greater enjoyment, smiling, laughing. Lee et al. In a longitudinal study of nurses looks at something very concrete. How long do you live? So women who went to church more frequently than once a week had a 33% lower risk of dying during the study period than those who said they never attended all else health constantly. And Idler et al., using the Health and Retirement Survey, found that respondents who attended religious services frequently had a 40% lower hazard of mortality compared to those who never attended, ceteris paribus. So, surveys of the religion and happiness literature make statements like the positive association between religiosity and life satisfaction is well documented. Or, in the vast majority of studies, religious people report higher well-being than their non-believing. So that leads to then the search for the active ingredient. So that's what Biswas Diener and Diener call it in their study. And they and a few other studies bring together a list of things that might be tied, might give us this positive association. For example, religion gives us comfort and solace about death. It can help give us meaning and purpose in life. It might give us much greater social support. There are all those wonderful religious rituals. There are positive emotions one gets in practicing religion. Like the song that bursts forth from me. There's the religious people leading a healthier lifestyle. And there may also be a self-selection of happier people are attracted. So what are these empirical studies that try to find the active ingredient? What are they? Well, Abrams et al. Find that religiosity is associated with less loneliness. There's your social support. Probably the most well-known of these studies, Lim and Putnam, says that social networks are the key to the religiosity happiness link. The positive satisfaction coefficient for religious attendance, they find, loses its statistical significance once you have control for the number of friends in one's congregation. As they put it, sitting alone in the pew does not enhance one's life satisfaction. More church friends, they find, leads to more happiness among those who say that religion is very important for them. Less so for those who say religion is not important. So I think maybe they go a little too far in saying sitting alone in the pew and its number of friends is the only thing that's important. Because it's got to be both you're committed to the religion and then you have a lot of friends in their study where you get that big positive. Haller and Hadler find that religious participation, but not other forms of participation, like being in clubs and recreational leagues and political organizations, is associated with that. Stark and Meyer, in addition to attendance, they have a variable called feeling that God is near to you that they find is associated with that. Childs, in what I think is kind of the best of the studies, has several questions that are asked about your relationship with God. And then a couple questions that are asked about the social cohesion of your religious congregation. And she finds that the relationship with God index has a larger impact on happiness than the social cohesion with fellow church members. Close out with a couple of economists. Sahigia et al. Find that religiosity is associated with greater insurance against income shocks. More religious people, when they have an income shock, income going down, don't have as much of a drop in happiness as other not so religious. And Clark and Lelkes find that religiosity is associated with a smaller drop in happiness for the unemployed. So pulling things together, my conclusion is that the religious point of view says that if you do those things like emptying yourself and turning outward to others, you're likely to become more happy. Reaching for God is likely to make you more happy, but you should also expect some suffering. And in fact, invite suffering in life because your Savior suffered for you. So this first group doesn't promise greater happiness, but often suggests that there could be greater happiness. The social science approach does find greater happiness, not from 0 to 10, but a marginal impact on happiness that's manifested in things like, lower death rates as well. Putting these things together, though, I do see somewhat of a mismatch, and that is that the social science literature can't get at all of the things that make a religious person happy. What it especially can't get at is those harder to measure. It goes where the light, where the numbers are. Especially you can measure, size of your church friend group and those kinds of things. But it can't really get at things that are going to be very important to the religious person. For example, on that list of 7 or 8 things, one thing that I found strangely omitted from that list is any mention of sin. Recall the earlier admonition that vice sets man at war against himself, with God, and with his fellow man. Sin causes unhappiness. Now, the Christian knows that his sin can be forgiven, that he can be made pure again and whole again. And non-religious people simply avoid that issue. The Christian knows also that God will take care of the injustices of this world, therefore has a lot less to worry about in life. The Christian knows that God is a merciful judge, far more merciful than mankind. The Christian learns that he can be a hero by taking the right side in the greatest drama in human history. So I think a greater recognition of the power and scope of religious beliefs to religious people needs to inform social science research heading forward.
So next is Philip Gorski from Yale University. He is a comparative historical sociologist with interests in theory and methods and in modern and early modern Europe. His publications include The Disciplinary Revolution, Calvinism and the Growth of State Power in Early Modern Europe, and Max Weber's Economy and Society, a Critical Companion. Today he's talking about the title of his talk today is Toward a Eudaimonic Sociology. Please welcome Philip Gorski.
Thanks. I'm afraid I have neither a PowerPoint presentation nor a handout. So in my talk today, I'm going to try to address 2 interrelated questions. Why do we need a eudaimonic sociology? And what would it look like? And my answers are necessarily going to be very tentative and very cursory. So first of all, why do we need it? Many reasons, actually. Intellectual reasons, first of all. Human flourishing clearly has social preconditions. Aristotle himself was quite clear about this. He thought that a fully human life was only possible within a particular kind of society, namely the polis, which is why his Ethics and Politics were originally conjoined in one volume. Modern social science has richly confirmed this. It suggests that the preconditions of human flourishing are sociological as well as psychological. Consider Martin Seligman's well-known formula for flourishing. Emotion, positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishments, PERMA for short. All 5 components have a collective or intersubjective aspect. So social science should have something to say about human flourishing. We also need a eudaimonic sociology for political reasons, perhaps especially in the United States. Need I point out that the U.S. is not flourishing? The opioid crisis, the obesity crisis, the mortality crisis, the isolation crisis, the family crisis, Prozac nation, political gridlock, a whole litany of crises that those of you in the audience will be only too well aware of. Now, contemporary social science is hardly the chief culprit in this crisis, but I do think that it is at least a contributing cause. Haven't many academic economists and psychologists helped reinforce and legitimate the individualistic and utilitarian excesses in American culture? And haven't many critical theorists and postmodern humanists responded with an unhelpful mix of cultural relativism and identity politics? I, for one, think so. Most contemporary social science falls into one of two broad categories: scientific or critical. Scientific social science gives us causal explanations and suggests technocratic intervention. Critical social science gives us analyses of power and oppression and calls for emancipation and autonomy. What neither gives us is positive solutions addressed to a broader lay public. That, it seems to me, is what's missing and needed more than ever. A social science that is positive but not positivistic, that is concerned with democracy and community, and not just with autonomy and liberation. In short, a eudaimonic social science. But don't we already have this? We have positive psychology, for example, which I've already mentioned. We also have the sociology and economic happiness, which I've alluded to as well. Now, this work can certainly be illuminating. I've read a good deal of it myself, but it does have some rather serious conceptual and methodological limitations. The main conceptual limitation derives from the focus on self-reported subjective well-being, law-dependent variable. That is, at best, an indirect measure of flourishing. For flourishing, on my reading at least, involves two main things. First, skillful and purposeful activity, and second, deep and sustained relationships. It also requires two further things: individual and collective freedom, and second, material and physical security. And one might add a proper balance between freedom and security. Then, of course, there are the methodological limitations. Most of the work in this area, at least the work that I've read anyway, focuses on statistical correlations between micro and macro level variables, classically between subjective well-being and per capita GDP. Though we've seen some interesting efforts to push beyond this approach here at the conference, the typical approach nonetheless combines methodological individualism with methodological nationalism. That is, it takes the individual and the nation state as its primary units of analysis. Now, let's set aside the question of whether these are even the right measures. I'm not sure that this is even the right level of analysis. It seems to me that eudaimonic social science should be focused primarily on meso-level organizations, workplaces, families, faith communities, neighborhoods, cities, and so on. And it should be focused only secondarily on how macro-level institutions affect them. The principal goal of a eudaimonic social science, as I'm conceiving it, would be to study social goods. Note that I did not say the common good in the singular. This is because I think that the good is plural rather than singular. Now, of course, as individuals, we do try to unify goods into coherent life plans. Some of us perhaps even into a coherent ethical or theological vision. Likewise, as democratic citizens, we search together for the common good and try to forge a good society. So there may be a certain unity to the good that we aim at the level of rational reflection. But at the level of everyday experience, in my view, the good is heterogeneous. The goodness of a fine meal shared with close friends is different from the goodness of a solitary hike in the mountains, which means that there is no one-size-fits-all recipe for individual flourishing. Some people should certainly take piano lessons, but others would be better off playing hockey. Some people should become professors, others ought to become carpenters, and so on. And what is true at the individual level is, I think, true a fortiori at the social level. Why? Because social goods are multiply realizable. As the philosophers in the audience will probably know, multiple realizability is a metaphysical concept first developed by Hilary Putnam and Jerry Fodor. The basic idea is that a higher order state or process is not always reducible to a lower order one. Example one, mammalian hearts all pump blood, but their microphysical structures are quite variable, both between species and between individuals, within, of course, certain functional parameters. Example two, Human anger will not have precisely the same neurophysiological correlates across individuals, or for that matter, across instances. Now, I think that the concept of multiple realizability can be usefully extended to the social realm as well. The structure of social relationships, such as friendship and kinship, may vary historically and culturally, but they are found in some form in all human groups and societies. The same is, of course, true of skillful activities. Different societies offer different genres of sport or different types of musical instruments. Social relationships and skillful activities are essential to human flourishing, just as hearts are crucial to mammalian life, but they are also multiply realizable. The key point here is that we cannot speak of the good society any more than of a common good, except at the level of rational reflection. So what, if anything, can we say about the goodness of a particular society, or the relative goodness of two or more societies? Now, within economics and sociology of happiness, the usual practice is to aggregate self-reports of subjective well-being into a global index of some kind. This is a useful start, but it has some very serious problems. The most obvious is that different cultures have different ideals of the good life. Some place more emphasis on happiness than others, for example. The other problem, noted above, is that flourishing has primarily to do with activities and relationships as opposed to emotions. Thus, the genuinely eudaimonic social science would also need to incorporate objective social level measures of eudaimonia as well. Which measures? Well, four seem especially important to me. First, measures of the quality and accessibility of social infrastructure. By social infrastructure, I mean very mundane things like parks and libraries and playing fields, schools, community centers, walking trails, and so on. In short, the material bases of human flourishing. Second, measures of the quality and quantity of social relationships of various kinds, families, friendships, neighborhoods, and so on. In short, what political theorists call civil society. Third, measures of personal and collective freedom, and finally, measures of material and physical security, or in negative terms, of the probability of misfortune. Such measures would also need to attend to goodness, not only in the philosophical sense of flourishing or well-being, but also in the colloquial sense of justice or rightness. The usual way in which social justice is conceptualized and measured within the social sciences is in terms of equality and mobility, typically in terms of material inequality and social mobility, formally in terms of things like Gini indexes and odds ratios. Like aggregated indexes of subjective well-being, such measures can certainly be useful starting points, but a eudaimonic social science would need to include other measures of distributive justice. Most obviously, we want to look at group-level variation in access to social infrastructure, the quality of social relationships, political and civil liberties, and material and physical security. By race, class, and gender, of course, but also by religion, region, age as well. Somewhat more subtly, I think it would also need to look at distributive justice vis-a-vis various types of human potential capability. Let me illustrate this point by means of a comparison of two societies that I know reasonably well, the United States and Singapore. Let's start with the case that is probably least familiar to most of you, namely Singapore. The adjective that immediately springs to your mind may be authoritarian. If they know one fact about Singapore, what most Westerners know is that the Singaporean government publicly caned an American teenager for an act of vandalism in the late 1990s. Once the image. It's not entirely inaccurate, but it is certainly very incomplete. Because Singapore is a flourishing society in many ways. It's a very wealthy society. It has a per capita GDP of over $94,000 a year, compared to about $60,000 a year in the US. It's also a very unequal society, however. Its Gini coefficient of 46 is almost identical to the US 47. But Singapore is also a highly meritocratic society with historically high rates of social mobility, much higher than in the US. What's more, it would stack it very well from a eudaimonic point of view. Every Singaporean has good access to public transportation, sports facilities, community centers, public parks, and high-quality schools. The city's housing laws and residential architecture also make it easy for extended families to live in close proximity to one another, often in the same apartment complex. It's also extraordinarily safe and secure. You would not worry for a moment about your adolescent daughter taking the subway home at 2 a.m. But not everyone in Singapore flourishes. For example, those with strong artistic or intellectual inclinations chafe at the legal restrictions on free expression and a national culture that prizes professional and material success above all. This is one reason why so many of Singapore's best and brightest intellectuals and artists eventually wind up in the West, despite strong mechanisms discouraging. In some ways, I think the US is a mirror image of Singapore. There's enormous space here for individual creativity, which allows intellectual and artistic types such as ourselves to thrive. This is one reason why so many artists and intellectuals still gravitate to our shores. But access to social infrastructure is highly unequal, as are life chances and material resources, of course. Meanwhile, globalization has hollowed out local communities and disrupted social relationships across the country, particularly in the old industrial centers of the Northeast and the Midwest. While racism and social inequality were certainly important causes of Trump's 2016 electoral victories in states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, so was the communal devastation in the towns and cities of Pennsylvania. Is there a happy medium between these two extremes? I think there probably is. I myself would look to the social democratic societies of Northern Europe and the more fully democratic societies of East Asia, such as Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. If you are an unincarnated soul behind a Rawlsian veil of ignorance, with no knowledge of your material resources or personal endowments, this is probably where you would choose to be born. So let us imagine that we, meaning we here at this conference, were given a blank check to develop a eudaimonic social science by a certain private foundation named after a successful Anglo-American financier, for example. What kind of knowledge would we produce? And whom would it be good for? Now, one view, the view of many of our colleagues in the soft social sciences and the humanities, the folks who do critical social theory, is that we produce non-knowledge that's good for no one, or worse, Foucauldian power knowledge that would allow us to discipline ourselves and dominate everybody else. Another view, the more optimistic view of some of our colleagues in the most scientific regions of economics, psychology, and biology, would be that we could produce a science of happiness that could be used to fulfill the fondest dreams of the Enlightenment. We'd simply have to place that knowledge and ourselves in the hands of some enlightened despots in Brussels and Washington, et voila, le bonheur. I suspect the result would be somewhere in between these extremes. I suspect that the knowledge we would actually generate would mostly be of a prudential and practical sort, rather than an imperative and positive sort. It would deepen our knowledge of what makes for individual and collective flourishing and ill-being. It would tell us what sorts of things we should worry about and strive for in our own lives and our societies. But it would certainly not tell us how to balance or realize various potentials and goods, not in any rigorous, rule-bound sort of way. As such, it would not be radically different in kind or value from the sorts of prudential and practical wisdom that comes to us through our religious and philosophical tradition, or that is developed in the course of a life well lived, for that matter, or from life in society. It would be a humble kind of knowledge, then, and one that left plenty of room for discussion and debate. It would contain a strong dose of history, anthropology, and sociology. As such, it would be a kind of knowledge that could feed into public debate in a democratic society. So it could, of course, also be used by enlightened technocrats who hope to institute some form of soft despotism as well. By way of summary, let me now return to the questions that I posed at the beginning of my talk. First, why do we need a eudaimonic social science? The answer depends on the we in question. We sociologists need to move beyond scientism and relativism, and eudaimonism points the way. we social scientists in the collective need to move beyond individualistic and utilitarian understandings of human well-being, and sociology provides one possible starting point for that too. We also need a eudaimonic social science for at least two political reasons. First, because of the massive malaise that currently afflicts many parts of the United States, and second, because the two main streams of contemporary social science, scientific and critical, actually reinforce and legitimate the main sources of this malaise, radical individualism and moral relativism. What would a eudaimonic social science look like? In terms of its objects, it would focus primarily on the meso level of social organization, and only secondarily on the micro and the macro. In terms of its methods, it would be highly pluralistic. It would combine qualitative and quantitative approaches and include a comparative and historical dimension as well. In terms of its measures, it would not be satisfied with subjective and individual measures of well-being. It would focus on objective and social preconditions of flourishing. It would also be open to interdisciplinarity. It would seek conceptual help from moral philosophers and be open to collaboration with other social sciences. In terms of its meta-ethics, it would not be monistic. It would think hard about the intersection between justice and eudaimonia, the right and the good. Finally, its primary audience would not be policymakers, politicians, and technocrats. Rather, it would be addressed to democratic public counterparts. Let me close by enumerating some of the key challenges that such a project would need to confront. First, the political challenges. There would be considerable resistance from within sociology itself. Some would denounce a eudaimonic social science as unscientific. Others would decry it as oppressive. Nor would such charges come only from within sociology. They would emanate from every corner of the academy. The only way that such an enterprise could possibly succeed is in alliance with like-minded scholars from other disciplines. Scholars in economics, psychology, philosophy, and so on. A gathering of scholars like the ones in this room. Nor would that be the only political challenge. The eudaimonic sociology would also struggle to reach the broader public. It would not be enough to write accessibly, for who reads nowadays, after all? The eudaimonic social science would have to be a media-savvy enterprise. It would need a YouTube channel, podcast, God forbid, maybe even some TED Talks. Eudaimonia, anybody? Thank you.
Well, our next speaker of the morning is Andrew Jungert. He is professor of economics and social thought at the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America and a fellow in the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. His publications include Inhabiting the Land, A Case for the Right to Migrate, The Boundaries of Technique, Ordering Positive and Normative Concerns in Economic Research, and Approximating Prudence, Aristotelian Practical Wisdom and Economic Theories of Choice. He's presenting this morning on varieties of virtue in economics. Thank you.
I do have a PowerPoint, so I can bring it up here. Yeah, I may need a password. Okay, that is it. Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here. I've enjoyed the last day and a half, and thanks to Adam for inviting me. Saw me give me this paper a couple months ago. I came to. I was trained in economics at the PhD level. I was working at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York about 4 years after I'd gotten my PhD in economics, and I had a modern college education, which means I hadn't read any philosophy or what I'd read got me nowhere near the Aristotelian tradition or the virtues tradition. But I knew I had this gap in my reading, so I figured, I just need to read some of the great books. And so I went to the St. John's College website and downloaded the list and started saying, well, what books do I have around here? I found a copy of the Aristotle's Ethics and started reading it, and I've really been in conversation with that and challenged by it ever since. So I'm always interested in this question about what economists do and how that captures what I'm reading in the Aristotelian tradition. What's not captured in that, which is where my last book, Approximating Prudence, came from. So I'm interested in virtue. This is a conference on happiness, but the two are related, at least in the Aristotelian tradition. It's from the Ethics. Since happiness is an activity of soul in accordance with perfect virtue, we must consider the nature of virtue, for perhaps we shall thus see the nature of happiness. So I'm interested in this from the economic point of view because in economics, because of a lot of the revolutions in economic theory and research, including some of what we're talking about here, the economists have developed a vocabulary that gestures towards virtue. They often think of themselves as talking about, we can talk about virtue now. Terms like temptation and self-control, fairness, reciprocity, altruism, persistence, and trust are starting to come up and be studied in this literature. But the real question is when an economist is talking about fairness, and you might say, well, this is really justice. Is he talking? What is the justice they're talking about? How does it match up? How does it map into the virtue ethics tradition? All right, so I want to talk about the ways in which what economists are talking about when it looks like virtue, how that maps into the virtue ethics tradition, particularly the Aristotelian tradition. And but for something to be a mapping between one space and another, you can't just draw an arrow from one to the other. You can't say, are there aspects of what economists are talking about when they talk about virtue that have counterparts in the virtue ethics tradition? The arrow also has to be able to go the other way if it's going to be a good mapping. You also want to know, are there things in the Aristotelian tradition that aren't mapping back, that aren't covered by what economists are talking about? And it could be that, I'm going to argue that there are parts of what the Aristotelian tradition, when they talk about virtue, that don't map back into what economists are doing. There may be other virtue traditions, and again, I'm on thin ice here, but it could be that in something like a Humean virtue tradition, there might be a much better map between the two. In fact, I think there's a much better fit between what economists think they're doing and a Humean ethics, which may be why economists are very, very comfortable with that description of human action. But what this means is that when economists say something about virtue, they may think, hey, we've got virtue covered, but they're actually taking a stand in disagreements about what virtue is and how society should be organized around those concepts. That's ongoing in virtue ethics. And often without thinking that they are taking a stand, because they think they've got virtue covered in some way. So, for example, I was at a conference several years ago where Deirdre McCloskey gave a paper on virtue, and the discussant was Samuel Bowles, and Samuel Bowles gets up there and says, "I agree with everything that Deirdre just said, but not because some philosopher said something 100 years ago or 200 years ago, but because I've seen it in data." And so there is this sense that if I've got data, that's all I need. I've seen all I need to know about virtue. Well, what virtue are you talking about? And how does that actually match up with these discussions? So that's what I want to talk about here. So my strategy is going to be to sketch out the moral landscape of Aristotelian ethics, in a very general way, because to understand what virtue means in that tradition, we need to understand what function virtue performs. Why is virtue important? What does virtue do in that tradition? And I want to sketch out the moral landscape of economics. And then I want to give 3 examples of sort of innovative disciplines within economics: social preferences, Samuel Bowles, cognitive bias and internal conflict, and then I want to talk a little bit about non-cognitive skills and the ideas of virtue that you get from those disciplines and how they match up. And so The moral landscape of Aristotelian ethics, I'm working off of some of Alistair McIntyre's discussion of this, although I've added some more steps there that I think are relevant to this particular analysis. So the first element of a moral landscape is a description of human beings as they happen to be. And in the Aristotelian tradition, this is animals that reason or that think, and we are this nexus of reason, will, passion. And there's some implied sort of disorder in that passion perhaps has too much of an upper hand at times, and that reason is the actions of reason in informing the will and thinking about what is pursuing the good as the good can be interfered with our desire for pleasure and our emotions. Step two here, which is not really in McIntyre's description, but I think is important, is a description of the decision-making environment in which people live. And this is characterized in the Aristotelian tradition by contingency. If you think in terms of social science, like I tend to, I think in terms of formal social science models that often have to be very quantitative. Contingency is everything that is in between that model and the reality of actually acting in the world. It's everything that you would need to take into account to actually fit that model into actual decision making. Everything you'd have to make judgments about. I like this idea of multiple realizability. Right? It's directly related to this idea that you can achieve the good in multiple ways, and things can go bad in multiple ways. That's very hard to model in any formal way. The third element, which is the second element in McIntyre, but I've inserted one here, is the third element is human beings as they could be if they realize their essential nature or telos. And in the Aristotelian tradition, this is captured by the idea of virtue, where reason sort of infuses the will, or at least directs the will, so the will becomes a rational appetite. And passion not being suppressed, but actually in the virtuous starts to cooperate with reason. And so what your reason tells you is good, the passion starts to desire as well as we grow. And so that's sort of what human beings could be if they realize their essential telos. Element 4 is how to get from 1 to 3. How to get from who you are, happen to be, to what you could be if you lived up to your potential. Before we move on to element 5, I just want to make a point about these first 4 elements, that they're very personal. So this is not just a social science description of people as they happen to be, but it's also a reflection on what they could be if they realize their essential nature. And so if you stopped here before politics, you'd be laying out a system that you would be willing to make a case to someone for. Say, you should live in this way. It's not just you happen to live in this way, but you should strive to live up to your potential described in this particular way. Element 5 is what sort of political community will promote, help people get from 1 to 3 and stay there. So what sort of institutions will foster, develop, and maintain the virtues, and what sort of rulers would be ideal in this sort of situation. So this is basically the politics. So this is the moral landscape of Aristotelian ethics. Where does virtue fit in? Well, virtue fits in handling contingency. In fact, the virtues are defined. It's very difficult to separate them from the contingency that forces us to make judgments. Virtue enters in moving people from level 1 to level 3, or at least seeing what that would look like. And virtue comes in discussion of the political community and its constitution and its rulers. So if we contrast this with the landscape of neoclassical economics, and so neoclassical economics is economics before the revolutions that I've been talking about, that I will say more about. This is essentially economics that is dominated by the rational choice model. It's no longer dominated as it once was, but just as a beginning, we'll start with that. So element 1 in this discipline is human beings still as they happen to be, but they are preference optimizers. Human beings as we describe them. They're well-defined preferences, and they're pursuing them in rational ways. Element 2, the decision-making environment is quantifiable, probabilistic, mathematically tractable. Right? In fact, we're defining element 1 and 2 so that we can characterize these problems as optimization problems that we can get insight from. Element 3, which is human beings as they could be if they lived up to their essential telos, really doesn't exist in the neoclassical. Right? There's nothing to live up to. There's nothing problematic about people pursuing their preferences. And so there's no element 4. How do you get from 1 to 3? There's nothing to live up to. We're basically trying to describe people as they are, and we're not inserting into this anything about what people could be. People are preference optimizers. There's nothing problematic about that. So element 5, which is the political community, essentially, since we don't see anything problematic, or we're not willing to see anything problematic in the way people pursue their preferences, basically, we want to design institutions so that people can pursue their preferences in line with other people trying to pursue their preferences. So we want efficient institutions. We want to make exchange efficient and set up and to sort of expand that circle of exchange. So where's virtue in this? Well, there's no contingency. People, basically, you're in a formal model. I think this is a general point. If there is no contingency and there isn't in a quantifiable model, then there's no role for virtue to grapple with contingency. There's no description of human beings as they could be, so there's nothing to try to get people to. There's nothing particularly personal about this because people just happen to be preference optimizers. We're not trying to convince them to be anything else. And so there's no real place for virtue in policy or policymakers. They're just trying to design efficient institutions so that people can make good exchanges. So if 40 years ago, we might have left it at this, but there have been lots of interesting revolutions in economics. So I want to consider 3 of them and how they modify this landscape. So social preferences literature, this is Samuel Bowles, Moral Economy. Gintis et al., Kammerer, the behavioral experimental revolution, where they're starting to look at the social aspects of preferences. So here you have concepts like altruism, reciprocity, fairness, betrayal aversion, and crowding out. So what does this do to the moral landscape of an economist who adopts this? Well, element 1, which is human beings as they happen to be, they're still preference optimizers. Their preferences are more complicated. They have social aspects to them, right? Moral sentiments. So I may care about fairness. I may care about reciprocity. The other person's payoff depending on how he's behaving towards me. Or I may just be altruistic and care about other people's outcomes. Right? So people are still preference optimizers. Their preferences are more complicated. The decision-making environment is still quantifiable, probabilistic, mathematically tractable, so that people can pursue those preferences that just happen to be more complicated. There's not really any description of human beings as they could be, and so there's not really any advice for how to get from what you happen to be to what you are. In other words, there's nothing particularly personal in this. As a policymaker, I may care about whether people have social preferences and whether I'm crowding them out. But I'm not making a case that if you don't have altruistic preferences, you should have them, that it'll make you happier. You're a preference optimizer. Whatever your preferences are, you should be pursuing. And I'm not going to try to argue that you should put something else into your utility function. But it's relevant, but it's mostly relevant for the political community. In designing efficient institutions, it's a little bit more complicated now because of the interactions of people's utility functions. So where is virtue in this? Well, still there's no contingency in people's decisions. So contingency is really the ground on which virtues operate. So there's no role for virtue in grappling with contingency. There's no nature to live up to or to aspire to. It's still impersonal. I would say that you're really not very far from the neoclassical model here because you really haven't changed its structure. You've just complicated the preferences. So I don't think there's anything like Aristotelian virtue in this, although, but there may be something closer to a Humean conception of virtue, where virtue, the question is, where does virtue come from? What's its genesis in sort of the evolution in people's social interactions? And even in that sort of the discussion of virtue is really of its social value and not necessarily its personal value in the Jungian tradition. So I acknowledge I'm on thin ice talking about Jungian virtue. So here, actually, again, when Samuel Bowles, in his book, he explicitly references Hume and says he's working in that tradition, but he also says he's working in the Aristotelian tradition. He doesn't really understand the differences and what might be capturing in one tradition, but not another. So what about this other behavioral literature on cognitive biases and internal conflicts? So this is the anomaly literature, the Gould and Pessendorfer talking about temptation and self-control, Thaler and Sunstein's Nudge book, which sort of summarizes it and reflects on its political ramifications. Human beings, as they happen to be, subject to biases because they have scarce cognitive resources, temptation, time, and consistency. So that's what they are. They're trying to maximize their preferences, but they have all these biases that make it difficult and scarce cognitive resources. Element 2, the decision-making environment is also changed here. There's uncertain options, uncertainty about probability distributions, or at least they have to learn about these things. And they're not very good about learning about probability distributions. So element 3 is interesting here. I think there is an element 3 in this literature. If human beings as they could be are actually preference optimizers. I think we've moved it from where it was in element 1 to element 3. So it's actually more explicitly normative that people should optimize their preferences, and these internal conflicts are keeping them from doing that. Element 4, I really don't think there is an element 4. There isn't really much advice, at least on a personal level, about how to get from level 1 to 3, although there is Dan Ariely, right? And so there is an advice columnist in the Wall Street Journal drawing on behavioral economics to help people make decisions. So I'm overstating it by saying there is no advice here, but it's not really, the discipline's not organized in this way to help people on a personal level to make more decisions, but there's fun interactions in discussing it. Most of the action here in sort of helping people get from 1 to 3 is at the level of politics, right? Nudge is all about how we could change the choice architecture to help people make better choices. And it still to help people maximize their preferences, right? Because when I want to help people to make better choices, I'm a libertarian paternalist. I want them to make better choices that they would think were better. Right? We want to help them maximize their preferences. So where's virtue in this? There's no contingency to manage, which is crucial in the Aristotelian tradition. Reason is still purely calculative. It's not managed. It's still working with probability distributions and things like that. Is it personal? There is something personal in it, but it's really still preference optimization with greater complexity. Very interesting complexity, but still greater complexity. The third innovation I will look at is the literature started by James Heckman on non-cognitive skills, which surprisingly, and I brought this in late in the paper because I've done work on, I've looked at his work before, and I came to it and said, well, I need to include it because it's actually surprisingly close to some ideas of Aristotelian virtue. In this, the non-cognitive skills literature, where Heckman, who's trying to understand the gaps in income and where they emerge, and as a consequence goes to earlier and earlier ages where the human capital is developed, and away from cognitive skills, education, stuff like that, towards what he calls non-cognitive skills. And so the list of these non-cognitive skills, which is from a summary article by Kautz et al., includes things like perseverance, conscientiousness, self-control, trust, empathy, humility, tolerance of diverse opinions. And these are all related in very important ways to outcomes in education, in labor market, and in life, whether you stay out of jail, whether you get married and stay married, things like that. And the differences in these non-cognitive skills open up very early in life, by age 2, 3, 4. And so what's interesting about this literature is that these skills, although in this literature they don't talk about contingency, these skills are defined in ways that you could see them as skills in handling what life might throw at you that you couldn't have predicted or couldn't predict. Things like perseverance, conscientiousness, trust, humility, being able to get advice from other people and support from other people, openness to experience. These are all things that gesture in important ways to what you might call Aristotelian virtue. And they are personal in the sense that there's a sense in this literature that if people don't have them, we can make a case to them that they should develop them, or more importantly, try to develop them in their children. There's a whole literature on the uptake of these virtues, what's in the way of it, and how can we argue to people that they should adopt these virtues themselves. So it does address contingency, although not explicitly in the way it's developed, and I think it actually is quite personal. Why is it so close? I think what's important in this literature is that non-cognitive skills are placed in the human capital production function and not in preferences. In this part of labor economics, the human capital literature, you're not looking at what people, there is a part of it where you look at how much education people are choosing, but in general, in the human capital production function, you're looking at the relationship between their characteristics and their earnings or other life outcomes. So it's not built explicitly on a preference optimization framework. And so he can look at this and say, well, look, people have these skills, have these outcomes, without having to have a commitment like you would if they were in preferences, that it must be good for them to have chosen these particular inputs. And so, so just to summarize, I don't think there's really any room for Aristotelian virtue in the neoclassical tradition, just to complete preference base. I think in the social preferences literature, you have something that may be closer to something like a Humean virtue, but not really an Aristotelian virtue. The cognitive biases literature, you put in these internal conflicts, which is very interesting. So there is something to live up to, but what you're living up to really are preference optimization, which sort of doesn't really get you very close to the Aristotelian tradition. And then surprisingly, I think in the non-cognitive skill literature, you get something of all these three that I think is closest to the Aristotelian tradition of virtue. I think the principal barrier, I'll just leave you with this, the Aristotelian virtue in economics is preference optimization, where you have fixed preferences, so there's nothing really problematic about them, there's nothing to live up to, and no particular personal case for virtue.